So here we are. We're from. All right, gang. So it's let me take off this one layer of mask here. It's my pleasure to introduce John Gibson. We've known each other for almost 40 years now, I think, John, like 35 or something.
Oh,
yeah. We were in graduate school together. And so what was funny is when John was a grad student, he wanted to have nothing to do with computers at all. But then he got involved in a project that they had at Princeton where they were developing a new notation software system. And John was kind of the alpha tester for the thing and got really fascinated by this stuff and actually started learning how to code. And then he and his partner, Allison Warren, who's a gifted computer musician and composer also, were located at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. And John just kind of became like this monster programmer. And
there was nothing else to do there.
Yeah, right. Or listen to Dave Matthews Band, you know.
Yeah. Well, or see Dave Matthews in the grocery store.
That's true. That's true. And that was back before they started having like horrible protests and things like that. So
yeah,
it was a decent place to live for a while. But he basically got involved in the RTC Next development project because the guy that I wrote the original version with, Dave Topper, went down to become their studio technician at the University of Virginia. So then John and Allison moved on to greener pastures, working at University of Michigan for a while. And then John got a job at University of Louisville, which was a bit of a commute. And then he got a better job offer from Indiana University, and Allison's teaching there also. So yeah, he's had pieces performed all over the place. His music is absolutely lovely. Yeah, he's probably one of the best programmers that I know. You know, him and Doug Scott are just like amazing. So anyhow, I'm sure there's a lot more I could say about him. You can follow the links in the syllabus and see what he's got going. But yeah, glad to have him here, and thanks for participating, John.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Brad. Really appreciate the opportunity to visit you virtually. And I'm sorry I'm not there because it's so much fun to be there. But here we are. So I wanted to do several different things today with you. And before I get started, I just want to say that I'm happy for you to, ask questions or say stuff while I'm doing things, because I can see you there from my corner of the room camera. I can see the backs of everyone's heads, so I think
I can zoom in on them if you'd like.
just randomly every now and then find somebody. So okay. I'll also have the chat window open in case you want to just throw a question or a comment. Like, one of the things that's really important to me is when I start playing audio, if I go for a while and it seems like I think you're hearing audio and you don't hear audio, please somebody let me know. I've taught a lot of classes last year where I would be a minute or two into it, and then I would start to see comments. Are we supposed to be hearing something?
That's happened to me too. You're a very successful composer.
Yeah. I mean, I've screwed up a lot of times with this, so it could happen again. So I wanted to take you through just a few things that I'm interested in these days, and in the course of doing that, I'll play some of my music. Try not to do, I'm not going to do like, it's not going to be one of these things where I say, oh, these are my pieces and here's 20 minutes of one of them. We'll listen to the whole thing. So I'll play you relatively short things, and then I'll kind of take you into some of the software stuff that I'm interested in for making sounds. And then, play examples, and we can monkey around with it and see what kind of sounds can come out. And I want to be sure that you have a pretty good understanding of what we're doing. So I may talk a little bit about some kind of background stuff that you may or may not need. And that's especially important for you to tell me, hey, skip over this, that we know this stuff, or if you have a question about it, that'd be great. But I think I want to start off immediately with getting a little sound into the air and have Brad play this video piece I did. And I'll just say a few things about it first. Can you see my slide there? Because slides are important. Oh, that's really small, Brad. Can't you do like a full screen or something, or do I have to like a? Do I have to?
Of that.
Ooh, ooh.
Or yeah.
There we go. That's great. That's perfect. That's no problem. That's perfect. So I did this piece called Edgewater, and it came about when I was in Florida for this residency. There's this thing called the Atlantic Center for the Arts. I don't know if anybody's been there, but it's a cool thing. You should go there sometime if you have an opportunity and there's somebody there you're interested in. But one of the best things about it was waking up really early, which I never do, and going to the beach, like at 6 a.m. or something when the sun's coming up. And I was really into doing this, and I had my phone with me, and I thought, oh, it looks really cool here too. So I thought I would I would do a little video that was, just kind of casually done. And eventually I realized I had some ideas, and I had a lot of footage that could actually be made into a piece that would interest me. And so I worked on it and did this piece. So I did the video and the audio for it. And so there's a couple of things about it that I'm really interested in. And one is the idea of, as I say here, auditory and visual scale. And so by visual scale, I mean, when you're at the beach and you're just sort of standing there right at the edge of the water, you can, of course, see really far away, and then you can look down and see things that are pretty small right at your feet. And especially if you have a camera that's a foot above the water, you can see a lot of stuff. So on the left side, you can see there's this little, I don't even know what you call those, little clam-like things starting to burrow. And the water, of course, is very shallow. So you can see the patterns of light on it. But also in terms of the audio that you hear, the sound that you hear, of course, there's sounds like right at your feet. So they're very close, and they can actually be fairly delicate and still be audible to a microphone at least. And of course, there's really distant sound that's, massive waves crashing in the background. And that to me is an experience that, it's really, it kind of occupies your head, like your visual sense and your auditory perceptual sense. And I think I realized that it was sort of making me, kind of putting me into a kind of daydream state almost, because there was a bit of unreality about it. And so I'm also really interested in the idea of presenting soundscape, like the natural sound of a place that you're in, and moving between the reality of that and some sort of imaginary construction of it, and possibly being kind of fluid in the motion between them. And I thought I would explore that in audio terms and visual terms in this. The last thing I wanted to mention is that unlike some people who do electronic music, I'm actually really interested in pitch. I love pitch. Pitch is great. I like really noisy things too, but I like to think of pitch sometimes as coloration for the sound that you're hearing, not necessarily as, a way to produce a pitch narrative that's starting somewhere and going somewhere. So sometimes I think of like noisy world sound as being sort of monochromatic, and that if you add just a little bit of pitch to it, like a constant sort of background chord to it, then it seems like it's sort of tinting a photograph, bringing color to a monochrome photograph. And so some of the pitch you'll hear in this piece has that character, that it's just static. It's just sort of sitting there, and it's really meant to kind of bring a different character to sound that's going on, that's, probably the ocean sound. But towards the end of this piece, there's a much stronger sense of pitch as being a kind of more sort of normative, pitch narrative sort of force. So it's like chord changes that are pulling you somewhere, and there's a kind of cheesy climax that almost seems like it's out of Tristan. So I don't want to give away too much, but so it kind of changes its conception of the role of pitch in the music. So I think maybe that's enough just to play this thing. And then after that, I'll show you maybe just a little bit about how I did some of the sound for it in RTC Mix. So Brad, I guess you could just kind of replace my thing and full screen it and let the audio go.
Hey, give me a yell when you want me to stop, okay? But here you go.
Let's play the whole thing. It's like, I think it's like 6,
Okay.
possibly 7 minutes or something. It's
And,
not, this is like the longest thing I'm going to play.
Okay, cool. All right, here we go. Cool.
Thanks. So can you hear me again?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Hey, John, something just occurred to me. I may go back and try and edit this recording a little bit because it occurred to me that that won't show up in the Zoom recording.
Yeah, you could just hand the recording off to me and I'll fix that and put, you know, maybe add a little stereo here and there.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. So I wanted to just sort of go to one, you know, particular spot. Actually, I don't remember where it is in the video exactly, but you'll probably recognize it, and talk about how I'm doing the sound there. So it's pretty simple. There's an RTC mix instrument called Filter Bank, which is exactly that. And so it presents a bunch of parallel bandpass filters like the ones you see diagrammed here. Hopefully you can see that. Are you showing me on your screen? Yeah.
Yes.
So if you take a bunch of these and stack them up across the spectrum and make the bandwidths fairly narrow, then you'll be able to tune them really carefully. And that's one of the ways that I use to color sound. So that near the end where those kind of waves are coming in and the different sort of colored treatments of the waves are happening, and there's different chords for each one. That's how this is done. The kind of razor sharp, tight bandpass filters, you know, precisely tuned to make those kind of chords. But also earlier on, where they're not quite as selective in what they pass, you still can get a sort of pitch flavor from it. And so that's the thing I want to talk about now. And I'm going to jump out of my PowerPoint to do this. So put that aside for a second. So some of my source sound is like what you hear in the piece, because, you know, you hear the actual source sound in there. And I can't remember exactly where the source of this one starts, but maybe it will say. I'm going to open a script to see what's going on here. So what does it say? It says, oh, its inskip is 0. I think the important part probably starts around 15. So let me just play a little bit of this ocean sound so we know what we're talking about here. Okay, so that was recorded, as I said, about a foot above the water that was coming towards my toes. So you can hear the ocean in the background. You can hear some much closer, more delicate kind of sound. So I put that into this RTC mix script, and I have, now I won't go through all the details of this because, you know, it's not that interesting to parse it exactly, but if you have any kind of question about what's going on, certainly you can ask. So I'll just say that the important thing that's happening here is that there are these two instruments down at the bottom as a stereo pair. And so Filter Bank obviously needs to have an idea of the different filter parameters that you're giving it. And those are coming in as the last argument to Filter Bank. And that all gets kind of put together up above. And this is one of the nice things in Mink or Mincy, however you say it, our sort of homegrown parser for RTC mix, is that you can make an empty list or array and then use some kind of loop to compute things to put in the array. That's a very nice thing to do, especially when making filter parameters. So I have a certain number of notes that I'm interested in here. And I guess above here, it's going to say how many those are. And where does it say it? There it is. So what's happening here, and I'll go into this in just a second, is I'm creating a bunch of pitches. And so I want to have a separate bandpass filter for each of the pitches and tune it so that you can hear that pitch. And so then, you know, that's coming into this array M pitch for MIDI pitch, and just finding out how many notes there are in that. And so for each one of the pitches I'm interested in, I set up, you know, do all the stuff to set up the parameters for the filter. And I actually didn't remember that there's an LFO going on too. So we have these things where you can do a kind of real-time modification of the data while it's playing. So there's some maybe slight jitteriness in the parameters, so they're not just straight the whole time in this case. So let me just say one thing about this, and I may have to, I'm going to open this up in here. Yeah. So there's a function that I made called IC factory, and that stands for interval cycle factory. Do you guys know what interval cycles are? If I don't know exactly what the background. Yeah, so I'm seeing a head shaking.
Some do, some don't. Okay.
Yeah, I'll kind of give I'll kind of demonstrate it. I mean, you don't have to look at the code for this, but just know that this is a separate function that I put together, and it lives in a kind of a library file that I use sometimes. And so that means I can use it in any of the scripts I'm working with just by including it, and somewhere I include it, like here I include it. So it's included there. And so that means I can just call the function that does this. So IC factory, the idea is that I want to create a range of pitches that go from really low to really high. So I'm starting at MIDI note number 39. And I'm going up to MIDI note number 136. And of course, you all know that there is no MIDI note number 136, but it doesn't matter here. We're just using that kind of numbering system to describe the pitches. And of course, they're not confined to integers either. So I have this range, and then I want to fill it with intervals. And so in this case, I'm making an interval cycle. And that just means that I have several intervals that repeat over and over again as you go up the keyboard. So for example, I'll start on MIDI note number 39, and then I'll count up 5 semitones from that, and I'll get whatever that is, 44, and then I'll count up 2 to 46, and I'll count up 4 to whatever it is, 50. I'm not adding well. And then I'll start all over again. So you're taking this little cell of intervals and just repeating it over and over again. So that in this case, the intervals in this cycle do not add up to 12 semitones. So that means that whatever kind of harmonic thing I'm doing here, it's not going to apply to all the registers that I'm creating. So it's not like an arpeggio of a chord through a bunch of octaves. And so this will be a more complicated kind of sound where in each register there's the harmonies you get are kind of inconsistent across the registers. And I kind of like that because I can hear the intervals in there, but it's not presenting a really clean, easily digestible sound. And we'll do those in a second, but I just wanted to play this so we can hear it, but just kind of a constant chord sound. And there's some natural panning going on because that's what the ocean is doing. And so it's kind of cool that you listen to it in a different way when it's got this pitch coloration, and you think of it more as constructed music rather than just natural sound. And so the two kind of get combined and you appreciate it in a different way. So it may have seemed like some of the pitches were changing during that, but it's really just that the spectral energy of the ocean is shifting, and so it excites different parts of the spectrum, and different parts of the spectrum have different chords essentially that are assigned to it. But if I go in here and I make this add up to 12, I mean, how far short am I to adding this up to 12? I'm really bad at math. So 5 plus 2 is 7, 4. So if I just add this, isn't that going to make 12? Yes. So let's see what the difference is here. So to make it even more extreme, I'll just do something like this. Let's see. There. That's the power chord of nature. So, although it's interesting, that really shows you that the spectral energy in this ocean is not all that low in frequency, because, you know, I'm not hearing a lot of low pitches there, but this is pretty, I mean, we could drop it, but I am not sure that would, not sure that would really add a lot to it if I made it 27. Let's see if it does. I don't think it does. Go to a different part of the ocean. Anyway, it's all very delicate there, I think, and gentle. Do you get the basic idea though? I mean, so if I did this, if I did 1, 3, 1, it's going to be much more crunchy sound. The chord there was more complex and less open sounding and just kind of more stressy. But I like this because it's, you know, just with a kind of simple setup, I can kind of set the sort of territory I'm working in, and then, you know, do a lot to it to get all kinds of different sounds going. And that also extends to working with the bandwidth. So if I make the bandwidth much narrower, then it should, you know, present something really different. So that's, you know, a more spiky kind of
But you heard gaps in that one. You know,
you could hear gaps there. Yeah, it was gapping for me a lot. I don't know why. I mean, there's nothing different about this than the other.
The narrow bandwidth, your filter coefficients have just increased quite a bit, right?
Yeah, that's true. But I mean, if, you know, yeah, maybe so. That's, who knows? I'm going to blame Zoom for that.
Okay.
That's very convenient. So no, we can't blame RTC Mix for things like that.
That's right.
Anyway, that's just a little taste of that kind of thing. Most of what I want to talk about is a different topic for sound making, and that basically has to do with the phase vocoder and some things I'm doing with that, both in RTC Mix and also in Max. And so I wanted to go through some of this. I want to make sure that I pace this so I'm not like overdoing it on certain details. So I thought what I would do is kind of quickly just sort of go over the sort of background information you need to know to understand what's going on. And so that means I'll be saying a few things about the phase vocoder and probably a little bit about the Spear program. I don't know if have you used Spear before?
Oh yeah, I mean that's our bread and butter here at Columbia. So.
Yeah, yeah, because it originated there for one thing.
That's right.
Let me make sure I have the correct audio driver for it while I'm looking at this. So I probably won't play a lot in Spear, but Spear is something I use a lot, often just for analysis. So what I wanted to do is, I think, let me go through some of this sort of background info here. It's not this one, it's the other one. PowerPoint. Apologies for the PowerPoints, but maybe this will be helpful to you. If you feel like this is, you know, unclear, or you already know it, or you think I'm full of BS. Just
You
tell
know,
me.
in this class, we haven't covered this at all. We did
Oh,
the Soldiers class, but not everybody here was in Dave's class. So
okay, awesome. So this will be just a little bit of background, and again, I don't think we have to delve totally into the details of this, but just to get a general idea of what's going on. When we're in a DAW like Logic or something, and we're looking at the tracks of audio, we're looking at waveforms, really familiar to anybody. And those are time domain samples, because those are, the x-axis is time, and then the y-axis is amplitude. And so that's the representation of the sound that we're normally looking at. But of course, we're also often seeing the spectrum of sound shown in many different ways in programs. And I'm sure you realize that there are a lot of processes that manipulate the spectral data before turning it back into sound that we can hear. And so I wanted to go over that process just a little bit. Of course, we're using the fast Fourier transform to take time domain samples and turn them into frequency domain samples. And so what does that mean? The bottom graph also has amplitude on the y-axis, just like the green graph above. Stop it. But on the x-axis, it has frequency instead. So we're starting at 0 hertz down here, and we're going all the way up to the sampling frequency. And in the middle, of course, is the Nyquist frequency. That's the highest frequency that we can represent for digital audio. So to go from the time domain to the frequency domain, we're using a process that's called the fast Fourier transform, which I'll say a little bit more about in a second. It's also possible to go in the reverse. So if you start with frequency domain samples, you can use the inverse FFT and turn them back into time domain waveform. And the interesting thing about this is that if you convert time domain to frequency domain and you don't do anything to that data, then when you go back using the inverse FFT, you end up pretty much where you started from. I don't know if it's exactly 100% exact, probably not, but it's very, very close. Of course, the thing is, if you start to manipulate this data, then you're going to not be able to get back to the original. So one thing to notice from this, and by the way, as I say down here, I took these from a really nice Max, a nice tutorial that's on the Cycling 74 website that goes over fast Fourier stuff and phase vocoding, and also gives you some Max patches to work with. I really recommend it. You'll probably find it there easily. One oddity here is that we're looking at all these frequencies, but it turns out that all the frequencies above the Nyquist frequency are useless to us most of the time when we're doing this kind of stuff. So any part of the spectrum above the Nyquist frequency, we generally discard when we're doing this in audio software. Okay, so this is what we have to know to be able to use this. Anytime we're converting from a time domain waveform to frequency domain representation of the sound, we have to do it in chunks of data, so chunks of sound. And so these are, we often called the Fft size. So it's a certain number of samples. And in this case, I'm showing a very common use of that, which is to have it be 1024 samples. It does turn out that these numbers must be a power of 2 for the fast Fourier transform. It's part of the efficiency of that process that makes it fast. And so you just kind of have to be stuck with that. It has to be a power of 2. These are some really common ones. And then what happens is that when you turn that into frequency domain information, you get the number of frequency bands in the analysis. So you're going to have a certain number of frequency bands, and they're all equidistantly spaced, which I'll show you in a second. But remember, half of those are over the Nyquist frequency, so they're not usable to us. So if I have an FFT size of 1024, I'm only going to get back 512 frequency bands. And they are evenly divided across the entire spectrum, which means that half of them are just in the top octave between 12,000 and 24,000, for example. Let's see. Okay, so this is showing some of that. I just said this. We ignore everything above the Nyquist frequency. And this is kind of how it works for, in a little more detail, for the frequencies that we're getting. If you take the sampling rate and you divide it by the FFT size, you're going to get a number that's called the analysis frequency. And in this case, I did it for us already. We're using sampling rate of 48K. Then what you're going to get is 46.88, and that's going to be in hertz. So that I'm calling 1 times F. F is the analysis frequency. So that would be this first frequency band. I should actually be pointing kind of between the bands, but never mind. The very first one is DC, or 0 hertz, but we're going to kind of ignore that. And the next one is going to be 46 hertz, 47 hertz. And then all of the other ones will be harmonic partials of that. So that means that there'll be integer multiples of the fundamental analysis frequency. So you can see that all of these are multiples of that. And a byproduct of that is that there are equal frequency differences between successive frequencies in the spectrum. And so what we're really trying to get out of this is the knowledge of how strong the energy is in each of these frequency bands. So that's why this spectrum here is going up and down. That's the amplitude spectrum. It's showing us the varied strength of these frequency bands across the spectrum that we can hear. So does that make any sense to you? Is that kind of semi okay?
So far, okay, I think, yeah.
So far, okay. So that's the basic process of doing FFTs. And so that means that when we convert to frequency domain, for each of these frequency bands, we have a time varying amplitude. I haven't gotten to the time varying part, but we have an amplitude value, and we actually also have a phase value for the frequency, and that's a little bit more obscure seeming. But what we really care about is understanding how this can evolve over time. I wish I had my magic. Maybe I do have my magic pen here. That would be fantastic. Ooh, I've got a red pen. So let's say that we do what I just said, which is to analyze that chunk of 1024 samples here. Then you can see it turns into a spectrum, which is this one that's furthest away from us. And then what you do is you want your analyzed frames of data to overlap. So you can see that if I just did a consecutive chunk of it, it would be here. But it's pretty obvious that there are a lot of other ones that are happening prior to that. And so you can see from the dotted lines that there are equal sized chunks that are kind of set up in these different spots. I'm not really doing a good job of this, but you can kind of tell that from looking at it, that I'm overlapping these chunks of 1024 samples. And then there's another one here that we could be doing. And then at that point, then we get back to this one. So it means that we have an overlap that's 4 times overlap. Another way to think of it is that there's something called hop size. So if you're a bunny rabbit and you're jumping through the garden, then you're hopping by a certain number of samples. And in this case, that number of samples is the FFT size divided by 4, which in this case is 256. So these frames of analysis data are separated by 256 samples over time. And so having this, this sort of data set of FFT frames evolving over time is what's going to, give us a lot of insight into what the sound is doing, and also give us a way to transform the sound over time. So that's how we get the time dimension into this, is by having a bunch of these things and overlapping them. So there's many more details about that process, which I'm going to ignore, but that's the gist of it. I will say another thing here that's really important to understand, and this is important for when you're using software like Spear and you want to produce analyses that you might be wanting to manipulate, you have a choice of FFT size. And it's good to know that there is an inherent trade-off between time resolution, that would be like rhythmic resolution, and frequency resolution. And you can see that in the next two slides. So this one has really good timing resolution. You can see it because everything is kind of vertically oriented, and I haven't played you the sound, but I'm not going to. Let's pretend that this is like a beat on a snare drum or something. You can see that it suddenly changes right here, and it's a brighter spectrum, which means there's more amplitude, more energy there for this one. And so you can see there are a lot of minute changes that happen over time. And that's because we have a very low FFT size. We're analyzing a lot of very small chunks as we move through the file or just in time. And so that gives us good rhythmic resolution, but the frequency resolution is bad. So there's not much resolution vertically across this scale here. You kind of see that by saying like it's 1 kilohertz going to 2 kilohertz, and it looks like there's only like 5 gradations there, if I'm not mistaken. So that's not particularly good. On the other hand, if I try to optimize for frequency resolution, we get something that looks like this. So you can see there are a lot of lines of frequency resolution here, lots of individual frequency bands, but the rhythmic information is very smeared. So we've lost a lot of resolution in time. And that's because we have a very high FFT size, which gives us a low analysis frequency, and that causes there to be much smaller distances between the different frequency bands. How are we doing so far?
Hanging in there.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. And by the way, you're welcome to take these slides if you just want to review this sometime. I'm happy to donate them. So here's where I want to talk about the phase vocoder. And this screenshot is actually from Spear. And if you zoom in enough in Spear, you'll see something like this. So what happens in the messy real world is that we can see all the frames of analysis here. So I actually can identify anything that's like a series of vertical dots is a single FFT frame. So that's just one of those chunks of, say, 1024 samples that was analyzed. And then for each of the frequency bands, we're able to just draw a line between the points to connect them. And that's giving us the frequencies that are coming out. And so you might say, if we have frequency bands that are related as harmonic partials, how come we just don't see straight lines here all the way across? I mean, that makes no sense that they wouldn't be like that, because that's how our whole thing is set up. You know, we have those fixed frequency bands and we analyze the energy in them, and that's the end of it. But the thing is, if you get a phase value out for each frequency band, in addition to an amplitude value, it's possible through some fancy math to compute an amount of deviation from the band frequency. So I'm going to do this by, I'm not going to do it, but I'm going to show you something by identifying the dots at the very left edge here. That's the very beginning of the file. And you can see if I keep going up like this, that these particular frequency points are all equidistantly spaced in frequency. That's because those are the band frequencies. But as you can see here, they're wandering all over the place, especially this one here. Now, there's a lot of voice crossing here. And that's just because the phase values from the FFT analysis are allowing us to compute an offset for the frequency for every single one of these bands. And what that means is that you have a much more detailed view of the frequency evolution than you would if you just had fixed frequency bands. If you just had fixed frequency bands and it was just straight across, you just hear like a sawtooth wave with different amplitudes in it, you know, with a particular fundamental, which would be the fundamental analysis frequency, which is this one right here, which is probably 46, whatever it was we saw, 46.8 hertz. Okay, So that's the really important thing. And so there's a little bit more here. I already said something about the inverse FFT. Oh, here's the other thing. We could use that inverse FFT to turn this back into a waveform that we can listen to. But there's this other method that's called Oscillator Resynthesis, where we can resynthesize this data using oscillators. So you could construct these in Max or some other program, like maybe RTC Mix. And so if you just take one of these lines here, which I'm drawing in blue, and I have no idea which one I'm tracking now, but say this is one particular frequency curve, then you can have a single RTC Mix note, like if you've ever used Wavetable before, that's going to play a sine wave maybe, and you can have the frequency of that sine wave moving around all the time. And if you also could imagine an amplitude envelope that's moving around, and you can see those black lines there, that indicates higher amplitude just at that one point, and the rest of these are lower. So it's a little hard to see the amplitude in this graph, this particular graph, but there is a time varying amplitude for each one of these FFT bands here. But you can render them by playing back a bunch of oscillators. And you need a lot of oscillators for this. In this case, you need 512 oscillators with varying frequency and amplitude. So, but that's a nice way to resynthesize, because you have a lot of control over the behavior of each partial, which I will demonstrate later on. And so I think that's about it. Oh, let's not get into this. So what I've been showing you is an old school phase vocoder where you're doing FFTs and they're just fixed, and you can start at the very beginning of the file, like this one that's already in red here, and you can go to the very end of the file and you have a coherent partial, we call it a partial track that goes from the beginning to the end, and all of them do that. All 512 of these partials would go from the beginning to the end of the file continuously, moving around as they like to do. But it's also possible to do a more advanced version of a phase vocoder called the tracking phase vocoder, where the analysis can describe kind of on-demand partials, as it were. So we only need a partial to last for these 5 frames here. We need a longer one here. This one needs to die here. This one needs to start over here. And so it's a much more flexible way of analyzing into partials that you can use later on. It means that there's always a variable number of partials at any one point. And in general, this gives rise to a better quality analysis and a better quality sound rendering. And this is what Spear is doing by default most of the time. You have to work at it to make it do a phase vocoder. You have to choose a different process. So tracking phase vocoder is where it's at for this. How are we doing now? I think I'm going to stop that. Yeah, so I'm going to stop this right now, and I may come back to it, but we'll just see. Yes, I want to discard my ink notations. And I'll put a bookmark in that because I'm going to maybe come back to that in a second. But I wanted to, let's see, I want to make sure I do this the right way and not waste too much time. So what I've been doing lately is using that kind of process, but instead of doing it in Spear, I'm doing it in RTC Mix or sometimes Max. And I guess I will go back to this slide for just a second and say something really, don't read all this stuff, okay? Don't read all this, but I'll just say the basic problem, one of the problems with the FFT is that you're trying to model noise using sinusoids. So in my case with the ocean, for example, most of that sound is really noisy. It's not really sine waves, but this process means that you're representing everything that happens in the sound as a combination of a lot of different sine waves at different amplitudes and phases. And that doesn't do a perfect job of representing the noise content of sound, which is, essentially random in a way. And it especially doesn't do a good job of that if you're manipulating the spectral data and turning it back into audio. It gives rise to a kind of metallic sound that I think in Spear, if you do enough work in Spear, you'll notice that a lot of the sounds you get in there have a certain kind of fingerprint. They have this kind of slightly metallic kind of tinge to them. And I think that's usually because it's not representing noise as effectively as it might. But there is a method, several methods actually, of injecting noise into this analysis so that in addition to having a time varying frequency and a time varying amplitude, you also have a time varying amount of noise, usually called a noise bandwidth, but it's an amount of noise for each partial. And that's a really nice thing to have, and it's fun to manipulate that. And so you can do this on a lot of software. Down at the bottom, there's a bunch of things that do it. The package I'm using is called Laris. That's something written by the people who figured out this method, Kelly Fitz and Lippold Haken at University of Illinois. It's also in Kima, a very good implementation of it in the Kima system. You can do it in C-Sound, Max externals from SynMat. Some of it you can do in Spear, but not particularly well. I think it's not thoroughly implemented there. And of course, also RTC Mix. Can do it in RTC Mix with an instrument I wrote called BWE Sine, which we'll be using a little bit of. Let's get that out of the way. So let's just look at a couple of things here. First of all, I'll just fire up Max for a second and say that this technique of injecting noise into sine waves is one of the oldest things in the computer music technical manual. It's from, like the early days of computer music in the 60s, or at least the late 60s, when people started to put together their own little building blocks of making computer music sounds. It's possible to modulate a sine wave with noise. If I just go in here, and I'm going to try not to blast you with this, but let's just listen to the sine wave for a second. Did you guys hear that?
Yeah.
Okay. So what this is multiplying a sine wave oscillator by another sine wave oscillator. Right now we're using this one. And so what's happening is that this one is going at 1 hertz. And so when you multiply that by another signal, you're essentially changing the volume of that other signal. You're scaling its amplitude in a cyclical way once every second. You kind of hear it do this bouncing and see it. And that's what we call ring modulation. So it's a very simple, that's really old, but it occurred to some people doing computer music, especially Jean-Claude Risset was one of the people who was really using this a lot, that you could do this with noise modulation. And so let's do it with noise for a second. So that's, really irregular motion, right? Because it's noise. It's a really slow moving noise. So I'm modulating a sine wave with noise. And the faster and faster the noise operates, the more it sounds closer to a kind, what we'd recognize as a noisy signal. But kind of somewhere in the sweet spot, you can sort of hear that's injecting a kind of instability into the sine wave. That's the essential nature of what it means to have a phase vocoder that has noise as a component, is you're modulating the sine wave of each partial track with a noise signal, and you can kind of adjust the intensity of doing that. This is not exactly how it works, but this is a kind of impressionistic illustration of how that happens. So let me just show you some stuff in CMix for a second that does this. And this is actually not really CMix. I want to, can you see my green window there? Is it legible at all?
Yeah, it's fine.
Okay, semi-legible at least. So what I want to do is, first of all, I'm going to play a little bit of flute noodling here. Okay, and you know, I could throw that into Spear and do an analysis. Maybe let's just do this real quick. And I'm just going to accept the basic parameters there. By the way, when you use Spear, you should realize that you type in a frequency resolution and then you can see the FFT that it's going to use. This is going to give you really good frequency resolution, but it's going to obliterate some of the rhythmic details we just heard. So I'm going to crank that up to 250 Hertz, and you can see that's using a much smaller FFT size. So it's probably going to be better rhythmic representation of it.
Sorry to interrupt. I'm
Yeah.
not really familiar with Spear. What exactly?
So Spear is letting you do the kind of analysis that I was describing on my PowerPoint there. So it's performing a phase vocoder analysis of any kind of audio waveform that you give it. And you can, you know, this one is one of those kind that does the tracking phase vocoder. So it's got a variable number of partials here. So I'm selecting one of them. I can just play that one just by itself, or I can play all of them, you know, kind of, which is what you would often do.
Yeah.
That's a pretty good, yeah, so it's doing that by playing a bunch of sine waves according to our analysis. And it's a pretty good result, this one. I mean, it's very easy to distinguish that from the original, but it's pretty good. And it's fun because you can do stuff like select everything and you can stretch it all. So that's what we want to do with these things usually. So I stretched it way out. And so now it sounds like, I got to move my zoom thing around. Here we go. Or I can do something like take all that and then scale it in frequency. So that's essentially transposing it. Then I go back here and zoom out a bit. Crazy. Yeah, it's cool. I think it's really
do the lasso and just move a section around randomly. That's what I always like to do.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Oh, whoops! I didn't do it right. Now you have to.
Gotta grab the
Wow. It's like a skateboarder. Yeah, you could just play that. Kind of doesn't start where it should. What I like about it is you can say, I want to select all the partials below a certain threshold of amplitude. These are all the soft ones. I can't imagine what Zoom is doing to that audio.
It's actually not bad. Yeah.
Really not bad? Okay. And then I want to delete them and see what else I got, you know. So it's really flexible to do some quick things to sound. So I use this all the time, even if I don't use it to actually render sounds that I'm interested in. It's a really good tool for seeing what's going on with sound.
Oh, and that was written here at Columbia by Brad Stevens.
Awesome. Where can I download it?
It's go to our webpage, go to software, and it'll be like the second or third link down. It's free, runs on Mac, Windows, everything, yeah.
And Linux.
And Linux, yeah. And he just came out with a new version for the new Mac OS too.
Wow, yeah, awesome.
Like 2 weeks ago.
Really? So
Yeah.
it's not, oh, I need to check up on that because
Yeah.
I'm way behind the times here.
Yeah.
No, I think it's a terrific program, and he's
Oh,
just
yeah.
lavishly
Good
paid
work.
for it.
It's great.
Yeah.
He
Also,
also has a very good dissertation that you should read if you want to know more about the details of this,
yeah,
how it all works. You know,
and you can also export all that information.
you can export it, and that's right, and that's thank you, Brad. That's good to mention that.
Because
Because,
you're right into it, didn't I?
yeah, so there are different ways you can export from it. And one of them is to use SDiff, which is a binary format that's widely used in the computer music world, and there's some different options for doing that. You can also export them as text files, and I do that because I have my own software that I work with for it. So I usually export it that way. So if I export it, you're going to come out with a file that looks kind of like this, you know, where it's text file. It's a pretty easy to read format. This is my own extended version of it that includes the noise stuff, which I guess I'll just not explain too much about. But basically the Spear generated ones look pretty much like this, and it's easy to parse that in a Python program or something. So I'll show you what I'm doing with this. So I did that, and so what I did was I recognized that this CMix instrument, the BWE Sine instrument, is what I need to render each one of these partials. You know, so each instrument is it's gonna play a single note that's one of these partials. And so if I wanted to resynthesize that flute noodle thing, then I just have to write a little script, and let me put my thing in here and see which one it is. This one. Okay. So, oh, I already seem to have it open. That's miraculous. Oh, I see. Sorry, I need to think more carefully about what I'm doing here. Let's do this. Okay. Let's edit anyway. Live dangerously, right, Brad?
Oh yeah, all the time.
Okay, so this is a bunch of Python stuff that I did. I wrote a program called Resynth, and it's a Python program that you can get online. It's on GitHub, and it just uses RTCMix to resynthesize this data, kind of like what we were doing in Spear, but there's many additional options that are not found in Spear. And I'll try to get to some of those here, but just so you get an idea about it, I kind of make this little form where I fill out all the parameters I'm interested in. So for example, if I don't want to do it in one channel, I could do it in 16 channels, and it'll spit out a 16 channel file. And that's a kind of cool thing to do. But if I'm just doing something basic, let's see if I can make this sound like anything at all. Okay, so I'm recreating the original, except it doesn't sound quite like the original. But
Actually, yeah.
it's fairly decent. This analysis was not produced by Spear. It was produced by Loris, which is a command line program that does this, and it comes with a C interface, a Python interface. So I have, you know, that's why I'm able to make my own little programs that do analysis that way. But I can say, hey, I want it to be like 10 times as long, and maybe I want to also do a little extra smearing of it. Sounded like air on a G string or whatever that Bach thing is, that descending bass line. I don't understand it. The other cool thing about this is that you heard the bass line, right? It was kind of going down. I don't know why that was happening. So strange. So one of the things is, do you see how this says IC Factory? Where have we seen that before? This is a version of the interval cycle generator that I showed you before. Works the same way. Give it an interval cycle, and here's one of them. And so then I can retune the partials. So it's essentially kind of quantizing the frequencies of those partials so they only hit the pitches that I'm interested in them playing. So this should sound different, I hope. Kind of irritating, but okay. It's more fun in stereo, so I'll put it in stereo. Yeah. Anything want to add about that at the moment?
Maybe the time scale, make it not quite as long so they can hear. You know,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's make it like a 2 and then make this be 1. Let's see. I think it's kind of bopping back and forth between those two.
Yeah.
Probably because of this whole step here in my interval cycle. If I use this interval cycle, which is this is a weird, this doesn't repeat. Maybe I should let it. No, let's just do it like this. This doesn't repeat at the octave, so that should be kind of unusual. Okay, kind of strange. I can also, rescale the frequency of it, so it'll be lower. Or I can do, let's, add another semitone, so it's going to repeat at the octave. What I like about this is that you get the realism of recorded sound, which is, a human behind it, but you can do these things to it that turn it into something pretty different in the end. I can also vary how much I want it to retune it. So if I make it like 0.4, this is on a scale between 0 and 1. So the strength of quantizing the frequencies to this grid that I'm giving it is, it's not very strong in this case. So we should hear some of those pitches, but maybe not all of them really. So it's a little bit detuned almost. Very easy to transpose as well, like if I wanted to have it go down more semitones. Okay, get the basic idea of that. So this is the kind of thing I enjoy working with. And it also occurred to me that I'd like to try this with some of the noisy natural sounds I like working with. So the ocean, but also things like rain. Rain is a great thing to work with. It's not something that is easily captured by an FFT. And so it's, really needs that noise component to it to come out okay. And so let me see if I can play. Okay, so here's a source sound I'm working with. This is rain on a metal roof, I think. So kind of big drops, and the analysis I did in Loris looks like this. I guess, let me see if I can do that, and just so you can kind of see what this looks like.
Wow.
So there's a lot of numbers, but it's pretty easy to read, honestly. So I like the fact that this is easily human readable. Here's a single partial, and the partial has 5 breakpoints. Can't really, maybe it's not so easy to see. Maybe it's not so easy after all. Anyway, each one of them is going to be time, frequency, amplitude, bandwidth. So time, frequency, that you can see that's the big number, 67 hertz, amplitude, and noise bandwidth. So this one has no noise bandwidth, but later on in the file, you'll see some that do have some noise bandwidth, like, for example, this one that has a little bit of noise component in it. So you get all that data, and it's easy to read it into some program that you devise, like this one. So let me open this up and see if I can make it do some sound. Really? I must have this open in some other place on the disk. Let's just see what this does. I'm going to not have it write this to a file. So this is much bigger. There's a lot more stuff here because I have a lot of options for selecting the partials in the file, based on a range of durations, a range of amplitudes or whatever, a bunch of other things like that. So a lot of the things in this file are just commented out. The gray text is not used at all, but it's there in case I feel like I want to play with it. I can substitute my own amplitude envelopes, which is sometimes a very useful thing to do. I have all the retuning stuff, and I have ways of warping the frequency spectrum and ways of resynthesizing additional partials that are modified copies of the ones that are in the file. So it's a very flexible kind of approach that lets you do a lot of stuff. You can have the partials are glissandoing, you can add LFOs to the partials and do stuff with the noise and the analysis. So there's a lot of things to play with here. And let me just see, I don't actually remember what this one does at all. Does anything at all. So that one went from being pure noise to pure pitch. So you can kind of have a, you know, a single control that kind of lets you work in that space between noise and pitch in the analysis. And so I enjoyed it.
You were stretching the time way out on that, right? So like each of those kind of things was like a single big drop.
Yeah, it's the time scale, right? That's right, because it's a factor of 15, which is a pretty dramatic stretching of the time, right? But I can do it, you know, the Bugs Bunny way, which is. And if there are all kinds of cool things you do. I don't know if this is going to do anything right now, but I could say make it be stretched out a lot and then have this is a way of making the notes themselves shorter and using an envelope that's more, you know, like an attack with a longer decay. Let's see if this does anything. Kind of weird.
Yeah. It's fun to try to figure out when it starts sounding like pitches. You know?
Yeah. I mean, you'd like it to be a kind of gradual transformation. I think a lot of times they don't really seem that way. That one seems a little more like it than many that.
Yeah, it's pretty good.
Yeah, but what I like about this is it all comes from the raindrops, sort of. So I'm going to skip on a little bit because I'm conscious of our time. And I think maybe it's time I'm going to play a little bit of music here, I think. Just this is an excerpt from a piece I did that was completely based on recordings at a nearby lake, which I think Brad knows because Brad grew up an hour from where I live.
Oh, actually only 35 minutes.
Oh yeah, that's with you driving though.
We were on the west side of town.
Oh, it's true. Yeah, that's true. So the sound that I'm using is kind of like this. This is the source material. It's a very windy day at this lake, Monroe Lake.
Oh yeah.
And you can yeah, so it's that's the kind of sound it was, and it was a very active day on the lake, I guess. And let me see if I can, not this one, the other one, which is, yeah. I just want to play some of this. So all the sound that you hear in this is derived from what you just listened to. So all of it's based on water, although there's quite a lot of pitch in this music that I'm about to play. So I'll play just an excerpt of this. It's about, as it says here, about 3 minutes, 20 seconds. Okay, I'll stop that there. So at the very end, when you heard those individual kind of wiggly lines that were kind of noisy, those are like literally individual partials analyzed from the sound, the sound of the lake waves there. So that's basically a kind of catalog of some of the techniques I've been using to transform, you know, inherently noisy sound into something that has clear pitch that can be used kind of harmonically, as it was in that example. Let's see. I think maybe I'd like to do maybe one more thing here, and this is going to take us out of RTC mix and into Max land for a second. I want to play at least some of this piece I did for chorus and electronics, and this has this particular movement is based on a poem by Elizabeth Bishop. And so in the beginning of the piece, you're just going to hear some electronic stuff and some wordless choir singing things. And then eventually a ghostly voice will enter and you might recognize the voice. And it'll be kind of pitched in a way. But that is one of these resynthesis with retuning. So let me just play this and we'll see how it goes. and then I'll show you a little something in Max that is used to make this.
No foot could endure it. Shoes are too thin. Broken glass, broken bottles, heaps of them burn. Over those fires, no one could walk. Those flaring acids and variegated bloods, the city burns. Tears.
Okay, I'm going to stop that before the choir jumps in. So let's see. Let me pull up the Max here so you can see some of that. We're allowed to use Max today, right, Brad? So this is basically just kind of a demo. Maybe I'll try to zoom a bit perilous in Max, but it's worth it, I think. So I started out with this.
No foot could endure it. Shoes are too thin.
Okay, so me reading it just with an SM58 or 7. And then I did a spear analysis of that. And so, it kind of looks like this. And
No foot could endure it. Shoes are too thin.
I can hear a little bit of that metallic kind of flavor to it, actually. So what I did was I made a version of this kind of process that we were looking at before with resynthesizing and retuning the partial analysis. I made a version of that for Max, which is this object called jg.resynth_. And so it means you can read in an SDiff file that has a spectrum analysis, and then you can kind of scrub across it.
No foot. No foot. No
kind of move across it arbitrarily. So actually, let me just get it to shut up for a second, and then I will see if I can play through it here. I think I have it all organized here to play, so should be possible to do that. Here we go.
No foot could endure.
Oh, wait.
No
Stop.
foot
Stop.
could endure.
Stop.
She.
Stop. Sorry, I'm screwing up. Okay, I think I have to actually initialize this thing. That would make sense. Yeah, there we go. That's more like it. Let's pull that back. Okay, this time for sure.
No foot could endure it. Shoes are too thin. Broken glass. Broken bottles. Heaps of them burn.
So it doesn't sound exactly what you heard, but what's cool about it is that you can kind of get in here and
No foot.
so I think that's as long as it is. But you can kind of traverse it arbitrarily and either make it more smoothly flowing or kind of glitchy, jumping back and forth, and I kind of like that. But it's as easy as just giving it a retune chord message with a bunch of MIDI notes that you're interested in it retuning to, and changing them whenever you want to, or getting rid of them and just playing it like
No foot could endure it.
So that's like the original sound, but I can have it be this instead. So that's a really convenient way of doing things. Unfortunately, this does not yet understand how to deal with the noise component, and I'm kind of slowly working on integrating that into this external so that it can make use of noise analysis as well. But I think that's the gist of what I wanted to talk about today. So I think I'll just kind of leave it there since we're getting on a little bit. And if you're interested in anything in particular, I'm happy to engage with you on it, or
Actually, I see it's up there. Why don't you show them a little bit of the spec delay thing too? Because that's pretty cool.
Oh yeah, this is I mean, that's kind of what you're hearing. So there's an effect that's put on this thing. So if I just kind of do or no, not that. So if I crank up the feedback here, where's the feedback? Here it is. You can kind of hear that it's sort of splitting the sound up, and hopefully you can hear that there are, actually I could do a better job of messing up the delay times here. Maybe hear that the spectrum is kind of fragmented and kind of bouncing around a little bit with a bunch of different echoes that aren't necessarily coordinated with each other. Let me see if I get some. Yeah, there you can kind of hear near the end that it's, like there's different echoes in different parts of the spectrum. So the idea here is that once again, the sound is split up using an FFT into individual frequency bands, and each one of those bands gets its own delay unit with echo capability, because it has feedback. And so it's nice to be able to control the delay times for all those bands, and also have feedback. You can control the feedback for all the bands at once, like I'm doing, or individual bands. And there's a whole range of different effects you can get from this. At this point, there are a lot of spectral delay effects out there in the world, and this is just one of them.
But this one's free.
This one is free, and this one has some problems, but it also has some good things about it that other ones don't. For example, one thing I like about this one is that you can group together adjacent frequency bands and apply them to the same delay, or it appears the same delay, so that you could say, okay, I want all the spectrum from 0 hertz to 2000 hertz. I want to split that into roughly 100 hertz increments as close as possible. And then above that, I just want it to have 2 other chunks of delay. And then just have, however many 12 different bands that 12 different delay times you're working with, or even smaller. And that's a very convenient thing to do. Instead of having to think about every single one of the FFT bands, 512 in this case, having its own delay time, that's kind of hard to process. And it's hard to do really good musical results with that all the time. So that's a great thing. You can also do EQ with it, of course, like any of these would allow you to do. Once we've got the bands split up, we can put a volume control on each of the bands, and then you can kind of change the spectrum of that based on your EQ shape. That's free too.
Yeah. These are now available to the world, right?
Well, the resynth is not, but I'm happy to give it to you. The only thing about the resynth I would say is I would not use it for live performance yet.
You always say it has never crashed on me, John.
Resynth?
Yeah, it never crashes on me.
Yeah. Well, it spits out a lot of error messages. I mean, I think that's not very many, actually. There's a lot of debug code in there that it's the problem with this. How many of you guys are programmers? Yeah, the Max programming can be kind of complicated because you're dealing with a high priority audio thread that's running, and that's sucking samples out of your external. And then you're dealing with control inputs that are either just regular slow moving ones like me doing that, or they might come from a metronome, like a timer source, and that's on a different thread. So there are these different threads of the process that have to be managed, and they can interfere with each other and cause terrible bugs and other kinds of problems. And so the complexity of this particular external is that it's using what's called a lock-free queue to transport data from one part of the external to another. And it's a lot harder than it should have been, honestly. But so that's why I feel like I'm reluctant to have people using it.
The easy way is just ignore all that stuff.
You can ignore it. Yeah, you can ignore it. But one of the things about this partial resynthesis is it will chew your computer up. I mean, one of the reasons I like having the Python approach is that if I figure out something that's just going to exceed the capability of my computer, it's very easy for me to write it to a file first, and it may take 10 minutes or something. But then I can listen to that 30 seconds of audio or whatever it is, just like the old days. But in Max, it's practically real time. And so you're kind of constrained by your computer's capability, and it's usually a single thread, like, most of it is on a single thread. Anyway, so that was that.
Yeah, I'll put links to all this stuff in the class web page too. So you can download.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. And Brad, I think I'm happy to give these things to people and have them mess with.
Okay, John. Yeah, we've reached the end of our time here.
Yeah.
So
Awesome.
yeah,
Thank you
thanks so much.
for sticking with it.
I'm going to shut the recording down now. So
Shut the recording down. Goodbye.